I had stats. This lecture.
Thank you all for attending the final round of the JC West 2020 debate competition. At this point, we wish to remind all those in attendance that audience participation in the debate is prohibited. Quiet, limited support is permitted for the parliamentary forum of tapping on tables. This forum is tapping the table with your fingers while resting the heel of your hand on the table. We remind spectators to keep this applause respectful to avoid interfering with their speeches. Any spectators deemed to be disruptive will be dealt with accordingly at the discretion of JC West staff with no warnings given. Please remain seated until the round is concluded and competitors have exited the room. Do not use cell phones or electronic devices at any point during the debate, and please take time now to ensure they are on silent or turned off. Time will be kept by the official timekeeper. Start and end of protected time will be indicated by a slap on the table. The end of each speech will be indicated by a slap on the desk with no grace period. A time card will be shown to indicate the end of each minute, 30 seconds remaining. I will count down the final 10 seconds on my hands as so. I'll be the Speaker of the House and will direct the proceedings. Without further ado, I now call the round to order. This round will feature Team B debating for side government versus Team Q debating for side opposition. On the resolution, this House, as the collective of the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, would secede from Canada. I now call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate with a 7-minute speech with the first and last minute protected.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. judges, Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise before the House today and speak in support of the opposition, in support of the resolution. This House, as the collective of provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, would secede from Canada. As Prime Minister today, I'm going to do a number of things for you. I'm going to go over what the status quo currently is, what we see as our need for change, our plan that we are going to put forward to implement this resolution, and my speech will focus primarily on the economic benefits of how the Western provinces will be better off economically as a result of this resolution. My second speaker will rise and give a speech on how the West has been politically left behind and neglected by Ottawa and the East as a whole. Our third speaker will give a speech on the disconnect between the lives of the East and the West. Let's begin with some definitions. Obviously, this House is defined as the resolution said, the collective of provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. And we'd like to define secede as establishing a new country independent from the control of Canada as it is today. The status quo, as we see today, Mr. Speaker, is that the Western provinces feel neglected under the control of Canada. They are taken advantage of and have been taken advantage of for too long in terms of their natural resources, their payments from the Western provinces going to the Eastern provinces for equalization payments and those things of that nature. And it leads to the formation of policies that aren't linked to the ideologies that people inside of the Western provinces believe in. Look no further than the carbon tax, a policy that was very unpopular amongst the Western provinces and that would definitely not have been accepted had there been a Western collective of provinces as the resolution is proposing today. Yes?
Honourable Speaker, does the current member think really that if the reason you secede is because your natural resources have been exploited for too long, the real secessionists should be Indigenous peoples?
The reason we want to secede from Canada is because we are having a lower quality of life for the people who are living inside of these provinces when we could otherwise be lifting them into a position that would be attainable should we not have to be supporting the provinces of Eastern Canada. The need for change that we see, Mr. Speaker, is the Western provinces need to be able to govern ourselves, look out for our best interests, and control our livelihoods without having to take consideration of the rest of Eastern Canada. So the plan that side government is proposing today is to secede from Canada within the next 2 years, taking in consultation from Indigenous groups, all kinds of other stakeholders, the citizens, businesses, and people of that nature. What we want to do today is to discuss the main ideas of this debate and to establish our intent to secede and take self-control. We only have 21 minutes today to present our case, and we wanted to focus on the big ideas and not focus on the fine details that would be focused on negotiations with the Canadian government later on. With that out of the way, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to get into my first constructive point, which is why the economy of a Western collective would be stronger than how they are today under Canada. The provinces hold so much of Canada's natural resources. They come in the form of oil, potash, uranium, natural gas, the agricultural lands, forestry in British Columbia. Canada uses the Western provinces as a crutch to be able to support them. I'd like to use the example of a cash cow. The Western provinces are the mouth, taking in billions of dollars and the resources that come with it, and the udder is conveniently placed down in the east of Canada, and it is taking all of what Canada has, Western Canada has to offer, with very little given in return. We have to free ourselves from their dependence to establish our own independence, and this will allow the West to control our own imports and exports and connect ourselves to a world that is more beneficial to Western Canadians as a whole. Yes?
Honourable Speaker, talking about the controlling of imports and exports, do you think you would get a better trade deal as a tiny little state, or one when you're connected to all of Canada and to negotiate with the buying power of 30 million people?
A trade deal that could be established with a country that doesn't have to focus on the support of many people that aren't able to contribute to the economy as much as many people in the West do with our industries that we have to contribute in the West, is very different from what Canada would be able to establish. Getting to my second point, Mr. Speaker, that there's unfairness in leaning on the West. And the people of Western Canada, right now are extremely sick of this, and this is why we want to take this action. I like to use the example of equalization payments, Mr. Speaker, which were made to ensure equal services across Canada, and the West sends billions to Ontario and Quebec every single year to ensure this. The effective of this can be debated on at a separate time, but the West is subsidizing Canada, and we don't think this is fair to the taxpayers of the West to be paying for the services of the East. We need to be focusing on what the people in the East are able to support themselves with and allow them to have a better quality of life that way. Yes.
Honorable Speaker, the current member must realize that tax money is often separated physically from the people who give it. Why is it different to support someone in the East than to support someone 3 cities away?
Because money closer to home is what you're going to see the results from. You're going to see supports to local businesses inside of their own provinces rather than off in Ontario and Quebec where they are not able to see the repercussions of what that tax money does. I like to use the example of the 2019 election as evidence that the people of the West do want this. There was the occurrence of the blue wave across the West, where the West is primarily occupied by conservative seats, except for a few in inner cities in, say, Edmonton and Calgary and Winnipeg. The West is still being ignored by Ottawa. This is an example of heavy-handed federalism making itself known inside the West without giving back to the people that is supporting it in the first place. We can use our own money to support those who live in the West and free ourselves from the East's grasp. So, Mr. Speaker, what have we done for you today? I've shown for you that the economy of Western Collective would be stronger than how it is today, and that the heavy-handed federalism that currently is occurring is negatively impacting the people of Western Canada, and that under the establishment of a new Western Collective, these people would be better off. So this, Mr. Speaker, is why we believe this will lead to a more prosperous Western Collective.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now call the first member of opposition to the podium for a 7-minute speech with the first and last minute defense.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I am going to get right into some refutation. So the first thing I want to touch on is this idea of consultation that came out of side government. This is very obviously lip service, but I'll take them at their word when they say they don't want to get too much into the details. Crafting a nation is a difficult thing, and we don't think it is their obligation to come up with a complete plan to craft a nation, but simply saying, oh, there will be consultation does not actually meet the needs of the stakeholders. Pretending that you are going to consult with Indigenous groups and actually weigh their opinions and desires fairly is completely untenable. It is not something that anyone would be capable of doing, and simply saying it is outside of the scope of this debate does not eliminate the harm. Okay, additionally, we have this idea of a stronger economy coming out of side government. And I have to ask the question, what makes an economy strong? This is too large of a question, of course, to do just in my refutation, but throughout the entirety of side opposition speeches for this debate, consider what makes an economy strong and consider that it is not a surplus of a single resource. That is not strength. Okay, additionally, we have this idea of money being closer to home is better. That was in response to a POI. I would like to point out that Manitoba is closer to Ontario than Manitoba is to British Columbia. So this idea of money closer to home, even if it were actually the case and how people truly feel, does not hold for this. So, okay, what does it mean to be Canadian? We think that there is a big question there. What does it mean to be Canadian? Because all of the people who live in these provinces think of themselves as Canadians first. People do not say, I am a Saskatchewanian, I am a British Columbian, I am a Manitobanian. People say, I am Canadian. This is the way that people refer to themselves. My coins have the Queen on them, my socks have beavers and maple leafs. I am a Canadian first, and this is the way people feel. National identity is important. And so we ask the question, why Wexit? What about Wexit? We sort of saw a little bit of analysis on this come from side government, the idea that there will be economic benefits, that we're sort of left behind and neglected, and that the difference between the West and the East is so significant that these people are not comparable and ought not be considered members of the same nation. On side opposition, we strongly disagree on all three of these key points brought forward by side government, and we'll be explaining exactly why. But first, I want to talk more specifically why Wexit, why these 4 provinces. It doesn't actually make sense. Consider Manitoba. Manitoba does not actually experience the same harms to the same level that Saskatchewan and Alberta do. This is evidenced by the absence of the blue wave that was not present in Manitoba, certainly not to the same level that it was in the rest of the provinces, and thus we must assume that attitudes in Manitoba are actually not the same as in the rest of the Wexiteering provinces. Now, including Manitoba within this union has two key problems. Number one, the people within Manitoba who do not want to Wexit. And number two, Manitoba is an economic liability. Manitoba receives transfer payments, including Manitoba in this union arbitrarily because having all of the Western provinces leave sounds better and is more fashionable does not make sense. You do not create a nation based on what sounds better. And I understand that side government is once again constrained by the motion they are given, but that does not eliminate the harm. Including Manitoba is an objective economic liability. Let us consider British Columbia. Once again, and even more so, we see the absence of the blue wave. The people of British Columbia are almost certainly not interested in Wexiting from Canada. The people in cosmopolitan centers in British Columbia almost certainly find themselves having more kinship with someone who lives in downtown Toronto than someone who lives in Fort McMurray. This is almost certainly an objective truth. I would be shocked if side government has analysis that shows me the majority of people in British Columbia want to Wexit, because that's not even a conversation that the people of British Columbia have begun to have at a provincial level. Okay, so why Wexit? Now that we've addressed the issues of like these four provinces in particular and why having these four provinces is inherently problematic, let's get into the question of why do they want to Wexit in the first place. We have this idea that the provinces feel unrepresented. And once again, I would contest that not all of the provinces feel unrepresented. That's mostly an Alberta and Saskatchewan problem. And it is a very significant problem. It is a very significant problem that these people feel unrepresented. That is not something that we want to oppose on-site opposition. We are willing to accept that that is the case. But what is wonderful about Canada is we are a democratic society. We currently have a minority government that is probably not going to last more than 3 years. I'll take you in a minute. And just because the people who currently represent you are not a part of the party that has formed government does not actually mean that you are not represented. It means you cannot push your priorities with impunity. It means that you have to negotiate with the rest of Canada, but it does not mean that you are not represented. People who are represented by a Green MP never say, oh, this Green MP does not have the majority of government and therefore our riding must secede. Simply taking this problem, scaling it up, and saying, oh, it's at a provincial level and therefore it is different, is not reasonable analysis. And just because these people do not currently feel represented, one, does not mean that they are, and two, does not mean that the response is to secede. But you would disagree.
Mr. Speaker, is it not a right of any person under a democratic society to be able to demand that they are able to depart from a country such as Canada?
No. Absolutely not. You cannot say, oh, well, actually, we are going to leave, and the people who don't want to leave, who are also a part of this province, are going to come with us. You cannot say, it is our right to leave, and when we leave, to take all of the Indigenous peoples who are on treaty land, which is treaties that are with the government of Canada. The government of Canada is responsible to Indigenous peoples, and we are going to now separate them even further from these people who, under status quo, are failing to meet the requirements that they have. Separate it even further. This is not something that people are going to want. You do not actually have the right to take someone with you. That is kidnapping. Okay, so why exactly do these provinces feel unrepresented? There's two main political goals that these provinces cannot achieve right now that they feel that they would be able to achieve if they had been able to form a majority government. And it is essentially, one, the desire to build pipelines across Indigenous lands without consultation, and two, not paying transfer payments. This sort of came up from side government, but it was veiled because they didn't want to address the ugly truth of it. They said, oh, we'd be able to transport our own goods and export them. This is the pipelines issue. We, on side opposition, see building pipelines across Indigenous lands without consultation as a harm, not a good, and we challenge side government to say that it is good to do that. And we think that paying transfer payments is an important part of what it means to be Canadian. Right now, the Western provinces are able to support Canada. How much longer is that going to go on? How much longer is it going to be profitable to extract and sell oil and gas? The world is becoming a greener and greener place. And when it does, the Western provinces won't be able to support themselves. And then you'll wish you hadn't Wexited. Thank you.
Thank you, first member of opposition. I now call the first member of government to the podium for a 7-minute speech. First and last minute effective.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. Before I get to my speech on how the West has been politically left behind and neglected by the East, and how a new Canada, a new Western Canada, can serve its people more effectively, I'd like to begin with some clash by the leader, or 2 points brought up by the leader of side opposition. Now, he first brought up that he himself identifies as a Canadian. Mr. Speaker, that's all well and good, but he's neglecting the fact that many people in Canada have come out in support of the Wexit Party, which had just very recently received official, or has applied and received the ability to become an official party in Canada, showing that not everyone here feels the same way as he does, even if that's how he feels. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, if we look at the last election, that is further evidence to that point. Secondly, different provinces have different needs, yes. Manitoba may be different than Alberta, may be different than Saskatchewan, may be different than BC. But there was still a blue wave in Alberta, multiple seats flipped. They are included in this argument because of their political alignment, not because of their economic alignment. Mr. Speaker, they were part of the blue wave, whether or not side opposition likes it a lot. You can look at the political maps yourself. There's also this idea of people do not feel are currently represented. Mr. Speaker, because of the population mass in the East, the political system will always have to dictate to them. And the Canadian political picture will always be catering towards the East. And that's just the reality of the system today. And yes, I'll take your POI at this time.
Honorable Speaker, how does this change in a Wexit where a majority of the population will reside in the urban centers like in BC?
Okay. With the example of BC, when there's a smaller amount of people making up the total population of Canada and making up the total electorate, there is a greater ability for them to receive the representation they need because they'll make up a greater proportion of the electoral and political and legislative bodies within the country, and therefore increasing their ability to make their own voices heard. And now I'd like to get into my constructive speech, Mr. Speaker. A new Western and Canadian alliance can serve its people more efficiently. People in the West feel like they have no voice or say about what happens in today's Canadian political system. We can do better than this. Much of Canada's political power is consolidated in the East in centres like Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal that have substantial populations, making up a large percentage of the Canadian electorate. Because of this, many times on election night, we see elections being called or past the point of being able to be regained by the time they get to the Western Canadian provinces moving across the board. Now, not at this time. Now, I admit that's kind of painting a weird picture of how elections work, but it just shows the amount of power that is consolidated over there in the East. The Western Canadian provinces, even by the time the polls are closing there, have no chance in making their voice heard. Mr. Speaker, there's drastic political differences that can be seen between the regions of Eastern and Western Canada. Not at this time. Historically, Western Canada has been substantially more conservative than Eastern Canada. We can look at the last election where both Saskatchewan and Alberta do not have any Liberal seats in it. Alberta was part of the blue wave, Manitoba was part of the blue wave, having many of their Liberal seats and NDP seats flipped to blue, and many of, also a couple of the seats in BC also flipped, showing that there's yes, I'll take your POI at this time.
Honorable Speaker, the Prime Minister Trudeau has already begun negotiating with Wexiteers. Where is the line between having your voice heard and getting your way unconditionally?
Because the political divide and the economic divide that the Prime Minister talked about are systemically ingrained in the system and are seen election cycle on election cycle, there is no reason why these countries need to stay together. Mr. Speaker, I'll use the example of the carbon tax. 3 out of 4 Western provinces have strongly opposed a carbon tax. And when the premiers challenged the Prime Minister Trudeau, they failed to have their voices heard in the end, further showing the political divide between the force of the East and the underrepresented West. This is unpopular policy in the West, furthered the political divide between these two regions. So why is secession the answer to this problem? if you have a country with two drastically different political zones that are regionalized, and two drastically different economies that are regionalized, as the PM noted, in the same regions, you can separate to give better representation, not at this time, to the people in those economies and areas, because they'll be able to get representation that more closely fits what they need politically and economically. And because of this, Canada should secede. A Western collective government can better represent the wills of the people in the West by eliminating the East from the political picture. People who have vastly different political, not at this time, opinions than those in the West, and therefore the people of Western Canada will be better represented. Even if we look at the examples of BC and Alberta, again, Mr. Speaker, and Manitoba, again, Mr. Speaker, these people are would be able to maintain provincial autonomy and still have a larger say in what's going on when we do not have to consider the voice of the East that is continuously being catered to by all of the parties in our current political system. So what have I shown for you today? I've shown that Canada does have a political divide. And because of this, Mr. Speaker, we can separate to ensure that representation is given to all people equally in Western Canada, and they are more effectively able to receive the representation that they need. Thank you.
Thanks, first member of government. I now call second member of the opposition employee for a 7-minute speech with the first and last minute effective.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You don't grow stronger as a country by ripping yourself in half. This is something that has been brought up again and again by side government, that this is going to make, fix all the ills, this is going to make Western Canada stronger, and this is going to give better political representation. But what we're here to do on side opposition is tear these down point by point by point. So they had two main themes. First, political, and then economic. So I'm going to start by refuting those before moving into my constructive about the rights of minorities within this new Wexit state. So let's start with the economic. So they talked about this idea of Canada uses the West as a cash cow. And yes, that might be true right now. There is large petroleum reserves in Western Canada. We are all well aware of that, and we are well aware of how that has helped the Alberta and Saskatchewan economies grow. But, Honorable Speaker, we are living in a time of intense climate change where every day it is becoming closer and closer to the point where we need to permanently phase out all fossil fuel consumption. And I ask side government, what is this Wexit state, this petro state going to do when they can't sell their oil and gas anymore? We are approaching this moment faster and faster and faster. When you are united in a union together, you have a more diversified economy. There is a strong manufacturing base throughout central Canada, which would support Western Canada when we get off of oil. And we know that that moment is coming faster and faster every day. So we see that point is falling. Secondly, in their economic, they talked about how Western Canada would have an independent trade policy and could control their imports and exports. But, Honorable Speaker, we see Canada as already being a strong negotiator. We have seen signing of deals such as NAFTA, such as CETA, such as CPTPP, which have allowed Canadians access to markets across the world. And we see these deals as coming because Canada is a large economy, because they are the countries negotiating it with it have access to this larger economy. The Canadians can get a better deal when they negotiate together as opposed to negotiating as two separate entities. So we see that point as again fallen. So secondly, they talked about this idea of politics. And they said, the West is being ignored again and again and again. And they gave this example of the blue wave across Western Canada. And we take two main points of contention. First, this blue wave did not occur across all of Western Canada. Honorable Speaker, Yes, almost all of Alberta and all of Saskatchewan voted blue, but Vancouver did not vote blue. Winnipeg did not vote blue. Vancouver Island did not vote blue. All of these areas are being left out inside government's analysis. Secondly, and probably most crucially, is that they have associated voting Conservative with supporting Wexit. Most people who voted Conservative did not want the country to separate. Most people who voted Conservative voted that because they have conservative values. And so we would like to see a response from that from side government. Okay, so now moving into my constructive about the rights of minorities. So I'd like to highlight two specifically, Indigenous people and Francophones. So we're going to start with Indigenous people. So we all understand that the Indigenous people of Canada have signed treaties with the Canadian government. Moreover, within the Canadian Constitution, there is an explicit statement of the special status of Indigenous people. And yes, side government has said, we'll consult them. But they have not explained what that means. Will their rights be guaranteed? Will they have the same treaty rights that they have now? But you disagree.
Mr. Speaker, would a Western collective not be able to better service the needs of Indigenous people?
No. Honorable Speaker, we do not see as splitting the country in half and cutting off Indigenous people from the rest of the country as being helpful to them. And that's going to move into my second point about Indigenous people. And that is that this is cutting their traditional lands in half. So we saw in Canada, when Canada and the United States separated their border along the 49th parallel, that line went right down the middle of traditional lands of many Cree, Sioux, and other people. What happened was people who were once one nation living together and could freely move, interact, live, and work together were now found themselves in a separate state. What side government is attempting to do is this all over again. So Indigenous people who have territory in both Manitoba and Ontario would see their lands cut in half, would see their nation being divided between two states. And they would not have the same ability to negotiate, and they would not have the same rights to interact and to maintain their culture through maintaining their relationships across these new lines that the Wexiteers are attempting to draw within this country. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the Francophones. So, within Canada, we see under status quo that Francophones have a special place and they are a protected minority. We also see that there is many Francophone minorities, be they Franco-Manitobans, Franc-Saskois, or others throughout Western Canada. What is going to happen to the rights of these people when they leave Canada? We have this in the Canadian Constitution right now, that French language rights are protected, that you have the right to send your kids to school in French if you were yourself taught in French or your language at home is French. What we see is a continued attempt of the erasure of French culture. We have seen no guarantees from their side or any mechanisms to prevent this. And we see this as a serious harm when we put these Francophone minorities into this largely Anglophone union of these four provinces. So, Honorable Speaker, what have we seen here today? I started by going point by point and breaking down first their economic and then their political arguments. They talked about how, the West was a cash cow, but the reason for that is because of its large oil reserves. And Honorable Speaker, we cannot depend on oil forever. And in the long run, giving into this short-sighted temptation and anger to split from the country will leave the West in a weaker position. It will also impact their ability to negotiate trade deals and get a good market for their products. Secondly, I talked about how this is going to adversely affect the minority, or the rights of both Indigenous and Francophone Canadians who we all wish to protect. And for all of these reasons, this motion must fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for having me here to speak on this very important resolution. We are here today to, of course, to discuss the people of the West, the individuals within the Western provinces who we feel would be better off and maintain a better future should they have the opportunity to provide their own governance and to be able to operate independently from the current country of Canada. Before I get into my main points, I'd like to begin with points of clash of what we just heard from the previous member. First and foremost, his opening line was, "You do not grow stronger as a country by ripping itself in half." However, this is paradoxical as it applies to the West currently because the West does not have an opportunity to grow stronger because they are quite frankly not represented in our current governments today. When we see the kind of dichotomy happen, it is not a case of tearing itself in half, it is a case of citizens, of individuals and of people trying to obtain the rights that they believe they have the right, that they believe they deserve in a democratic society. Furthermore, he spoke on this idea that the West is only sustained by large petroleum reserves, and this is fundamentally not true. This is a fundamental falsehood when you look at the economy of the West. Yes, it is resource-based, but no, it is not all petroleum. Take a look at the the prairies are called the breadbasket of Canada, the breadbasket of the world for a reason. We produce 3/5 of the food that Canada consumes, and that food is agriculture is further used to export globally. It's further used as a major trading piece. Furthermore, if we look, yes, you disagree.
Honorable Speaker, can the current member explain how agricultural services or farmers are disserviced by the current government?
Mr. Speaker, we see constant examples where the current government does not understand how a farmer's life truly operates. As our members have brought up, things like carbon tax adversely affect the farmers of the prairies because they are reliant on using that or burning carbon for their practices to actively live, actively survive, and actively make a living. When we see this disparity, we see a lack of understanding of the Western people from the current Eastern government, and that is something that we are looking to combat with this resolution. When there is a lack of understanding between the West and the East is when we create a large political rift, something that is currently happening, something that we see all the time. Yes?
Honorable Speaker, could the member please explain if the West is so against the carbon tax, why did BC have one before the federal mandating one?
Foundationally, we're looking at the West as a collective of provinces here, and 3/4 of those provinces are strongly against a carbon tax. Why? Because those citizens are adversely affected. It is not an option to not drive in the prairie provinces. It is not an option to simply park your vehicle in your garage and no longer use it. You would disagree?
Honorable Speaker, if the issue is that 3/4 would agree, do 3/4 of Canadians not think a carbon tax is good?
They do not, because the West currently does not have the opportunity to express that fact, and when they do try to express that fact, they don't get heard. And that is the problem that we are facing today, is when the West does not have the opportunity to have their voice heard. We talk about, not at this time, when we talk about things like a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, we are adversely affected here in the West because people rely on it every day. For example, if a rural community has a disaster, there's a car accident, it's going to take more than an hour and a half of driving to get to the nearest hospital because 92% of our hospitals are in urban centers. That is a bias that has been created because our federal systems, our federal healthcare systems, have created more prosperous opportunities to maintain urban centers versus supporting the rural centers that we need to support in the West. The similar things apply when we talk about things like the RCMP, the federal police, Madam Speaker. If a rash of crimes recently occurred in southern Saskatchewan, and the response that those individuals got when they called because their homes have been broken into, because their livelihoods have been threatened, was that we are too far away to get there in time to do anything, and therefore we are not going to come. This is a federal service that is quite frankly being denied to the people who so dearly rely on it. Would you disagree?
Honorable Speaker, acknowledging that municipalities have control over their own policing and can fire the RCMP if they want to and put their own services in, could the member please explain why contracting out policing to the RCMP is such a point of contention for the West?
Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is the fact that the federal government does not understand the needs of the West, and therefore did not have ample opportunity to make the proper changes, to give themselves a chance to actually implement that sort of change. We see further things as we move into the Indigenous point the member spoke on. The northern Indigenous people of Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC are being adversely affected by our current government. We talk about having a consultation with these individuals. We talk about it because we know currently their needs are not being met, and therefore this Western separatist movement would be able to better meet those needs. Not at this time. For example, Madam Speaker, 50% of Canadian children in the northern provinces were being found as hungry. Or being found as hungrier than they should be, hungrier than what was considered healthy by our governing standards. the government in Ontario, 2 provinces away, decided they're going to tackle this problem. They're going to make an effort to make something, to make it better. They implemented new services, they implemented new ideas, a new board. What happened, the result of that 2 years later, was that 50% number became 70%. It became more and more detrimental to those people because the government is so disconnected from their base needs. A Western separatist movement, Madam Speaker, would allow for proper consultation to happen with these groups, be it the Francophones, the Indigenous people, or the minorities, other minorities within, to ensure that their needs are being adequately met. Yes.
Honorable Speaker, can the current member give us an example of how that negotiation is going to go? And one of the key contentions of the Wexiteers is the transport of this material through Indigenous lands.
Madam Speaker, we would once again be looking for active solutions to these kind of issues. Quite frankly, when we talk about something like the pipeline, like the pipelines that are running through those lands, we're looking at benefiting all Canadians, including those Indigenous people, growing a stronger economy for all of those individuals, growing a stronger economy, growing a stronger opportunity for, therefore, success for those individuals. The fact of the matter is, currently in Canada, people on reserves, those Indigenous people, make on average, have a median income of $14,000. Those Indigenous people living off reserves, that is $23,000. Because right now they are not being economically supported. And therefore, if we were able to, as a Western separatist movement, be able to consult with them more freely, consult with them more candidly, and ultimately understand what they needed, what their unique situations were in the West, we believe that we would be better able to solve those problems. So, Mr. Speaker, fundamentally, what we've seen is a disconnect between the East and the West, a disconnect between the people there, and that is fundamentally ironic and fundamentally false and a bad idea when the government in Ottawa is making decisions for those people in the West. It is for these reasons we believe this motion should stand, and we believe that this motion will bring a more prosperous opportunity for the citizens of the West. Thank you.
I now call the third member of opposition to the podium for a 7-minute speech with first and last minute protected.
Honorable Speaker, I'd like to begin my speech by quoting a premier of a Western province. When I fight with my wife, the first thing I do is not ask for a divorce. We work through our problems. And that is what side government will have us do. Every time there is a fight, the right thing to do is not to run away. The right thing to do is to work through your problems, and that is through the democracy we have established within Canada. So, let me get started with a couple of points that came out of the previous speaker's speech. He claimed that they're not stronger when they're separate. He said that Western Canada would be stronger separated from the whole of Canada. But let me remind them again of what we said, and that has not been addressed. Western Canada's main strength has been petroleum. If side government's going to deny that, we all know that is basically not true. The main point of contention in the Wexit issue is the idea of the movement of petroleum, and that contributes far disproportionately within their economies. And this is a finite resource, right? So when a finite resource disappears, what then? What happens when an oil state runs out of oil? You get Russia. Furthermore, let's talk about the idea of the carbon tax and how this hurt the farmers, which is also a major contributor to the economics of Western provinces. Let's talk about climate change and farming. Climate change will ruin farms. It will destroy our ability to grow food and sustain ourselves. This is a preemptive measure to continue being prosperous as a nation as a whole. But let me continue on. He also stated that, things like healthcare could be better. Things like security with police force and defense could be better. But Honorable Speaker, under status quo, provinces control their own healthcare. If Alberta wants to make their healthcare better, Alberta is more than free to do that. And again, the Ontario police force exists. If Alberta and Saskatchewan and the Western provinces aren't happy with the RCMP, they are more than welcome to create their own provincial police force. This is allowed under status quo. They haven't showed why this is specifically equated to Wexit. Now, let's get to another point of contention. So they would be able to better work with Indigenous people. I clearly don't understand this. We've established that the main point of Wexit is the movement of petroleum. We all know that it is the minority of the Indigenous people within Canada that strongly oppose this. And the federal government is keeping these Western provinces from bulldozing them over. What happens when they only have these Western provinces to work with? They won't be heard. The Western provinces are after to move their oil, and they will not take no for an answer. So where does that leave the Indigenous peoples to, that we as Canada owe and promise to protect them? And the federal government is protecting these minorities. Furthermore, they even talked about, in general, how Western Canada becomes, I'll take you in a minute, becomes a minority within Canada. But that still happens as Western Canada if it were to become a nation. You would have minorities in that nation that would not be heard, right? So the people in metropolitan Vancouver, should they then secede because they don't feel heard and make up a significant part of the Western Canadian country? But you would disagree.
Mr. Speaker, considering that the recent ruling that provinces do not have the authority to overrule national infrastructure projects like the pipeline, and the fact that side government has not mentioned pipelines today, how can that be the most contentious issue we're talking about in today's debate?
That still doesn't dispute the fact that the federal government owes it to the Indigenous people to protect them as a minority. We've seen when colonialism occurs and we arbitrarily start splitting up borders without thinking about the cultural implications and the borders that it has for these Indigenous peoples, we're only making things worse, and we owe it to them to stop splitting up their lands when we already have. That is the main point. Furthering splitting their lands is still a harm, even if the pipelines aren't. But thank you for that. So let's go through our debate piece by piece, right? So all the issues they talked about still happen within their Wexit province, right? So Sam came up and gave the example. Should a riding that elected a Green member, although is not the majority of government, feel the need to secede? No, because that is democracy. The majority of what the people want is what the people will get. And in a representative democracy, when you elect your rep, they rep your values and they rep your wants and needs within our government. We have a collaborative government. Take, for example, now, we have a minority government that is forced to work with this new blue wave MPs in order to get things done and to make things happen. Our government changes continually, and we don't make it stronger by just splitting it further and further and creating these problems on a smaller scale. This is a short-run fix. That is going to create long-term problems. So let's get into this other contention of transfer payments. Again, yes, the Western provinces, we all know, pay an excessive amount of transfer payments, but that still doesn't minute the fact that Manitoba is one of the largest recipients of this and heavily depends on them. How would this change in a Western Canada? They would still require this amount of support. Furthermore, again, we've seen throughout the history of Canada, those who receive transfer payments and those who give transfer payments change continually, right? So when the Western provinces need it, Canada is there to support it. Because as Sam stated, that is what being Canadian is about. We help each other, we cooperate, and when a fight occurs, the solution isn't to split away from each other. The best solution is to come together and think of a solution that works for everyone. Next, we talked about how this will work on an economic scale. Canada has entered several multinational treaty agreements, right? What happens to NAFTA or the CTPT and all these deals, they do not include clauses for a Wexit nation occurring. And we see that economies of scale are such an important factor at play when we're negotiating, right? So when you have a small country negotiating with a bunch of large ones, they have less buying power, they have less power at the table, and this is going to be worse for the Wexiters. How will they manage this trade difference now? And again, you've seen from our side of the house that this will only exacerbate current problems that side government has pointed out, that it's not actually solved by having these Western provinces secede from Canada, how this blue wave does not necessarily reflect the needs and wants of people, because those who voted Conservative did not necessarily vote for Wexit. And for all those reasons, this motion must fall and we must remain Canadian.
Thank you, clear member of the opposition. I now call member of side opposition for their 4-minute rebuttal, which is completely protected.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. We asked at the start of the debate, what does it mean to be Canadian? It means peace, order, and good government. It means you're polite and you like hockey. You live in a cultural mosaic and you cooperate with the people you disagree with. To paraphrase a hockey player who will remain nameless, Canada is good. And this is what we believe on side opposition. We believe Canada is good. And I'm going to systematically explain, using the metrics that side government wanted us to use, why they have failed on every aspect of this debate. So they said there are three things that are going to be most important to a Wexited nation. Number one, economic benefits. Number two, people will no longer feel they're left behind or neglected. And number three, the East-West differences. Let's get into the economics. We didn't hear much clash from side government with any of our claims about the fact that this is not going to be a sustainable state. They said, oh, but there is agriculture. But that alone is not nearly enough to support an economy. The only way that Western provinces can hope to continue to diversify their economy in the way that is necessary is to remain a part of Canada and to invest into those fields. It is not enough to look to the past and say that things will be the way that they were. We need to look forward and we need to grow forward. Now, we also have this idea that people are feeling left behind or neglected, and this comes in with the government representation. Once again, we heard no clash with the most important contention, and that was, as raised by my side of the House, the fact that not everyone who voted Conservative wants Wexit. The Conservatives are not the Wexit Party. And we heard about the Wexit Party from side government, and they said the fact that it exists alone is enough to prove that there is a popular idea of Wexit. But I'll remind everyone that the People's Party existed, and they were actually a party, as it were, in the same way that the Wexit Party is, ran a candidate in every riding across Canada, and did not manage to elect a single MP. Just because you are able to say, oh, we have a political party, does not mean you have a political movement. The two are non-comparable. Okay, we also have this idea of East-West differences, and this, of course, is true. People are different all across Canada, but on-side opposition, we see this as a good. When we pointed out to side government that the people in British Columbia are different from the people in Alberta, they said, oh, but that's different because they're a small portion of the nation who don't want what the rest of the nation does, so it's okay that a smaller portion is going to do what the larger portion wants in order to support them. To me, this sounds awfully familiar. It sounds like what is going on in Canada now. So I would like to see any analysis whatsoever from side government about why it is okay for the Wexited provinces to say, okay, British Columbia, we're not really going to listen to what you want, but you're a smaller part of this new nation, and that's why it doesn't actually matter, but we actually left Canada for exactly this reason and brought you along, even though we acknowledge that you didn't want it. We've heard a lot of strange rhetoric out of side government saying, you know, this isn't actually about pipelines, this isn't actually about resources. And they can try and cloud it and muddy it as much as they want, but if you wave away the fumes, it's very obvious what's actually at play here. This is a reactionary political movement that is meant to strike at a federal government that people feel is unfairly penalizing them. And perhaps they are right that they are being unfairly penalized, but this is not an appropriate response. Seceding from the nation is not an appropriate response because there is not what is necessary in order to secede from the nation. When Quebec attempted to secede, they failed, and they had a much stronger case. What we do not see from the Wexiting provinces is any sense of unity except for anger against the federal government. It is not enough to be reactionary. And the evidence of this is the fact that throughout this debate, we have been referring to them as the Western provinces, the Wexiting provinces, the Wexiteers. There is no clear identity that binds them together other than this supposed anger at the federal government that, as we have shown you on side opposition, does not even exist across all four provinces. The economic factors, which, as we've shown you on side opposition, does not exist across all four provinces, and this feeling of being different, which does not exist across all four provinces. Thank you.
Side opposition. I now call a member of side government for their 4-minute rebuttal, which is completely effective.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take a step back and sort of do a 30,000-foot flyover of tonight's debate, exploring some of the roles and responsibilities of each side, and showing how side government effectively and conclusively proved that this resolution, being that the Western Canadian provinces should secede from Canada, should pass. Now, we were given the burden by side opposition of proving that the Western Canada would become stronger as a country. And we believe on side government that we have effectively and conclusively done that today. How? I'll explain that. Starting with the Prime Minister's speech, we showed that there's an economic disconnect between the two regionalized economies in Canada, and how there's an economic drain through things like the transfer payments, and just a lack of understanding from the East of how the Western Canadian economy works, and how seceding from Canada as a whole, the Western Canadian economy can release many of the Eastern blockades to Western economic empowerment, therefore proving that we should secede. Now, the second speech on political disconnect. We showed that there are, using the historical examples of the political histories of Western Canada, as well as the current realities of the political system today, that there is a disconnect between the East and the West, and how the Canadian political system, considering the population that is residing in the East, must always cater to the East. And therefore, separating and forming a new country can give people in the West who have previously had no voice or little say in the Canadian political system, can suddenly make their voice heard, therefore proving that we as the West should secede from Canada. And our third speech, that the West is that the needs of the West are not understood by the federal government. Mr. Speaker, our third speaker mentioned that if we were to secede, a smaller Western Canadian government would be better able to meet the needs of all stakeholders because they would be more easily able to specialize to them. These are people like the Francophones mentioned by side government or side opposition, like the farmers, like the Indigenous people. Anyone in Western Canada can have their needs better addressed by a government that is better representing them and not someone who is thousands of kilometers away in Eastern Canada. But what have we seen from side opposition? We've seen incorrect facts noting that there is not a political connection across the East. Okay, even if we take that as true, we noted in our second speech that because the representation will be smaller, places like BC and Manitoba will be able to get better representation comparatively because they still won't have to compete with Eastern Canada, so they'll have a larger voice. We've seen a failure to accept our ability in our plan to cater to the stakeholders because they simply wanted to bring it up in one of their arguments, in one of their speeches, and therefore that must fall because we conclusively explained in our third speech how this would happen. And secondly, there's this idea of that our whole side was based on pipelines and Wexit, and I believe I explained in my POI that is not true, that we're talking about an economic disconnect, a political disconnect, and the ability to meet the needs of the people in the West from the government. And because of this, Mr. Speaker, we believe that side government has effectively and conclusively proven that the Western provinces need to secede from Canada and that we need prosperous opportunity for all Western Canadians. Thank you.